This chapter is on Giffen goods. We have discussed in the last chapter the inferior goods, for which it is the case that when incomes rise, their demand falls. Now for Giffen goods, it's even a stronger effect that is the case, namely that if their price increases, then their demand would increase. Now this is very counterintuitive at first, and so what happens graphically can be shown again with a diagram where we have two goods, x1 and x2, and we have the budget line that reflects the relative prices of these two goods. Now you would have a certain utility maximizing consumption choice where you are located on the indifference curve that is farthest from the origin. So in this case of this consumer, it would consume this amount of good x1 and this amount of good x2. Now in our thought experiment, assume that the price of good 1 increases. So what would happen in this case is that the budget line rotates in a clockwise manner around the point where it intersects the vertical axis. So that means that the person here could, if it spends all income or all the budget on good x1, afford less than in the previous situation. If preferences are drawn as they are here, this would imply that the highest indifference curve then would be attained at the point where consumption of good 2 decreased and consumption of good 1 actually increased. So there are preferences for which it could be the case that if the price of a good rises, its demand increases. And these goods are given goods. From a graphical perspective, we now know what is going on in terms of given goods. However, I think many of us have problems to come up with an intuitive example of which goods would be given goods and for which goods it would be the case that if their price rises, their demand would increase as well. For this reason, I tried to come up with a very intuitive example that makes the point hopefully quite clear, and that would be the case if you have a family, say, that lives close to two restaurants. One restaurant is a cheap fast food restaurant and the other one is a Michelin star restaurant, a very fancy one that is very expensive. Now say the family prefers to go once a week to the fast food restaurant and once in a week to the fancy, more expensive restaurant, and then the cheaper restaurant actually increases the price. Then for the family it would maybe the case that they would need to reduce the number of restaurant visits, or on the other hand they could also reallocate from the more expensive option to the cheaper option and hold the number of restaurant visits constant. And there it could be, for example, that the optimal response to a price increase in fast food restaurants is to go into the fancy restaurant only 3 times a month and to the fast food restaurant once more a month, so that there is a reallocation from the more expensive option to the cheaper option, which saves money that can then be used to keep the number of restaurant visits constant. But that implies that the option for which the price was raised, there the demand for this option would increase. So in the case here we would have that fast food restaurants increased their price, but the family increases the number of visits to fast food restaurants and decreases the number of visits to the fancy Michelin star restaurant in order to keep the overall number of restaurant visits constant. And there are many other examples for which something like this may happen. For example, if you have basic food versus more expensive meat. So if a family lives close to subsistence and decides to eat meat twice a week, and then there is a basic food that they eat 5 times a week, and then the basic food price increases, so then the family could not afford the more expensive food 2 times a week, but would reduce it to once a week and would actually increase the consumption of basic food from 5 times a week to 6 times a week. And that would also imply that the demand for the good for which the price increases. I hope that this conveyed the intuition of how given goods works and how they can be described graphically, although it's a quite counterintuitive concept at first. Thank you very much for watching the video, and I hope you found it interesting and useful. For more videos on economic content, please visit my channel that you find here to the left. And to the right, you see the next video in the series at the top, and at the bottom, you see the whole lecture in the form of a playlist.